In a city where the line between law and corruption blurs, veteran police officer Luke Rollins makes a routine arrest that will shatter his world. But when the man he apprehends turns out to be Jacob Foster, a powerful defense attorney with a hidden agenda, Luke is thrust into a deadly game of deception and betrayal. As he unravels the truth, Luke discovers that his own son may be involved in the very corruption Jacob is fighting to expose. Torn between loyalty and justice, Luke must confront his deepest fears and decide where his true allegiance lies. In this gripping tale of redemption and sacrifice, no one is who they seem, and the stakes are higher than ever. Will Luke risk everything to bring down the darkness within his own department, or will he lose everything he holds dear in the process? Shadows of Justice will leave you questioning the true meaning of justice and the price we pay to uphold it. In the bustling city of Eastwood, veteran police officer Luke Rollins patrols the same familiar routes he has for over 20 years. To the community, he is known as a tough but fair cop, someone who knows the city and its inhabitants like the back of his hand. However, years of experience have also ingrained in him a set of assumptions, biases he is not fully aware of, but that subtly influence his actions. One afternoon, Luke notices a man, Jacob Foster, sitting alone on a park bench engrossed in a book. Jacob is a tall black man in his early 40s, dressed casually but neatly, his demeanor calm and collected. Luke's instincts tell him something is off. A black man, alone, in this part of the city, not one Luke recognizes. He fits a description from a recent bulletin about a suspect wanted for a string of burglaries. As Luke approaches, the situation quickly escalates. Jacob, knowing his rights and feeling the weight of yet another unwarranted stop, tries to remain calm, but Luke's suspicion and need to assert control take over. Despite Jacob's calm explanations and attempt to defuse the situation, Luke handcuffs him and takes him to the precinct, ignoring the growing unease gnawing at him. Upon arriving at the precinct, Luke's world begins to unravel. Jacob is not just another civilian. He's an influential criminal defense attorney known for his work against police misconduct. Worse, Jacob was once on the short list for a federal judgeship, making his wrongful arrest more than just a routine mistake. It's a potential career-ending disaster for Luke. However, the plot twist is that Jacob is secretly investigating a deep-rooted corruption ring within the Eastwood Police Department, an investigation that could implicate Luke's closest colleagues, and possibly Luke himself. Jacob had been in the park that day, meeting with a whistleblower. The wrongful arrest was an unintended complication in Jacob's plan to expose the corruption from the inside out. Jacob's arrest sets off a chain of events that forces Luke to confront his own biases and the dark side of the department he has served faithfully for decades. As Luke's career hangs in the balance, he must decide whether to join Jacob in his quest for justice or protect the only life he's ever known, even if it means covering up the truth. For Jacob, the wrongful arrest is deeply personal. It's a stark reminder of the systemic racism he has fought against his entire career. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, he must navigate a perilous path, seeking justice not just for himself, but for the entire community, all while dealing with the emotional toll of constantly being seen as guilty before proven innocent. Plot twist ending. As the investigation deepens, Luke uncovers a shocking truth. His own son, a rookie cop, is unwittingly involved in the corruption Jacob is trying to expose. Torn between protecting his family and doing what's right, Luke is forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. In a dramatic climax, Luke chooses to help Jacob bring down the corrupt officers, even at the cost of his own son's future and his career. But in a final twist, it is revealed that Jacob's investigation wasn't just about justice. It was also about redemption. Years ago, Jacob made a mistake in his youth that led to a close friend's wrongful imprisonment. Helping Luke's son and cleaning up the department is Jacob's way of atoning for his past, giving the story a powerful message about forgiveness, redemption, and the complexities of justice. This story, Shadows of Justice, dives deep into themes of systemic racism, personal redemption, and the moral dilemmas faced by those within the justice system. The emotional tension between Luke and Jacob, their respective battles with their own pasts, and the ultimate choice between loyalty and justice create a narrative that is both compelling and thought-provoking. In the heart of Eastwood, a city where the lines between law and order blur into shades of gray, veteran police officer Luke Rollins has spent over 2 decades patrolling the same streets, following the same instincts. But when he arrests Jacob Foster, a distinguished criminal defense attorney with a reputation for exposing police corruption, Luke's world is turned upside down. What begins as a routine stop in the park spirals into a life-altering crisis. Jacob isn't just another civilian. He's an influential figure whose wrongful arrest could cost Luke everything: his career, his reputation, and his sense of self. Yet, as the dust begins to settle, Luke uncovers a deeper truth. Jacob was in the park that day for a reason, and his investigation could bring down not just corrupt officers within the department, but could also implicate Luke's own son, a rookie cop in a web of deceit and betrayal. Caught between protecting his family and exposing the corruption that threatens to destroy his city, Luke faces an impossible choice. As the tension mounts, both men must confront their own biases, their past mistakes, and the harrowing question of what justice truly means. In a city where shadows loom large and trust is a scarce commodity, Shadows of Justice is a gripping and emotional journey into the heart of a system on the brink of collapse. With a twist that will leave you questioning the very nature of justice, this novel explores the complexities of redemption, the weight of personal sacrifice, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Physical description: a tall, rugged man in his late 40s, with graying hair at the temples and deep-set blue eyes that reflect years of experience. His build is solid, with a slight stoop in his shoulders from years of wearing the weight of his badge. Backstory: Luke has been a police officer in Eastwood for over 2 decades, following in the footsteps of his father, a decorated cop. He prides himself on knowing the streets and the people of his city better than anyone. However, the pressures of the job and a lifetime of assumptions have gradually hardened him, making him blind to his own biases. His commitment to the force is both his greatest strength and his deepest flaw. Physical description: a tall, athletic black man in his early 40s, with close-cropped hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His brown eyes are sharp and discerning, with a quiet intensity that commands respect. He dresses in tailored suits, projecting confidence and authority. Backstory: Jacob is a prominent criminal defense attorney known for his work against police misconduct and systemic injustice. He grew up in a tough neighborhood, using education as his way out. His personal experiences with racial profiling have fueled his passion for justice. Despite his success, Jacob carries the burden of a mistake he made in his youth, which led to the wrongful imprisonment of a friend, a secret that drives his relentless pursuit of fairness. Physical description: a woman in her early 40s with sharp, discerning green eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She has short, practical auburn hair and a lean, athletic build from years of early morning runs. Backstory: Captain Bennett is the first female captain in Eastwood's police department, known for her strict adherence to procedure and her commitment to reform. She's dedicated her life to cleaning up the force from within, often clashing with the old guard. Beneath her tough exterior, she genuinely cares about her officers and the community, striving to balance the demands of leadership with the moral complexities of her position. Physical description: a young man in his early 20s, with a lanky build, light brown hair, and hazel eyes that mirror his father's, but with a touch more idealism. He carries himself with the eagerness and uncertainty of a rookie. Backstory: Ethan is Luke's son, a rookie cop trying to prove himself in his father's shadow. He joined the force to make a difference, but the reality of police work has been a harsh wake-up call. Unwittingly caught up in the department's corruption, Ethan is torn between loyalty to his father and his sense of right and wrong. Description: a large, imposing building with a mix of old and new architecture. The front is a polished, modern facade, but inside, the narrow hallways and worn-out furniture reflect decades of history. The precinct is a microcosm of the city's complexities, where the buzz of activity contrasts with the underlying tension among the officers. Description: a sprawling, green oasis in the middle of Eastwood, with old trees, winding paths, and a tranquil river that cuts through the park. It's a place where the city's diverse residents come to escape, making it a focal point for the community and for the story's key events. Description: a sleek, modern office in a high-rise building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Eastwood. The decor is minimalistic but sophisticated, reflecting Jacob's meticulous nature. The office is both a sanctuary and a war room, where Jacob strategizes his battles against injustice. Description: a modest, two-story suburban house in a quiet neighborhood. The home is warm and lived in, with family photos lining the walls and a small, well-kept garden out front. It represents the stability and traditional values Luke clings to, even as his world begins to unravel. Setting: Eastwood Police Precinct, early afternoon. Summary: Officer Luke Rollins starts his day with a routine patrol, greeting familiar faces in the precinct and receiving a briefing on recent crimes in the area. He's given a vague description of a suspect wanted for a string of burglaries. A tall black male, early 40s, who has been seen in a few of the city's parks. Luke dismisses the briefing as just another day on the job, but takes note of the suspect's description as he heads out to his patrol. Cause and effect. The briefing plants the seed of suspicion in Luke's mind, making him hyper-aware of the description as he starts his patrol. Setting: Riverside Park, late afternoon. Summary: Luke patrols Riverside Park, scanning the area. He notices Jacob Foster sitting alone on a bench, reading a book. Jacob's calm demeanor and physical appearance match the suspect's description from the briefing. Luke's instincts, colored by years of experience and subtle biases, lead him to approach Jacob. The interaction begins cordially, but quickly escalates as Luke's questioning grows more accusatory. Jacob, feeling the weight of being profiled, remains calm but firm in his responses. Cause and effect. Luke's initial suspicion leads him to approach Jacob, and his escalating questions push the situation toward confrontation. Setting: Riverside Park, minutes later. Summary: as the tension rises, Luke demands to see Jacob's ID. Jacob hesitates, knowing he's done nothing wrong, but aware of the potential danger in refusing. When Jacob finally hands over his ID, Luke barely glances at it before deciding to arrest him, convinced that Jacob is hiding something. Despite Jacob's attempts to explain, Luke cuffs him and leads him to his patrol car, ignoring the stares of onlookers. Cause and effect. Luke's decision to arrest Jacob sets off a chain reaction, leading to significant consequences for both men. Setting: Eastwood Police Precinct, early evening. Summary: Luke brings Jacob to the precinct, where the usual buzz of activity continues. As Luke processes Jacob, he begins to feel a nagging doubt but pushes it aside, focusing on the paperwork. Meanwhile, Captain Laura Bennett notices the arrest and starts asking questions. She's immediately suspicious of Luke's actions, especially given Jacob's calm demeanor and professional appearance. Cause and effect. Captain Bennett's suspicion marks the beginning of a deeper investigation into the incident, setting up future conflicts. Setting: Captain Bennett's office, late evening. Summary: Captain Bennett calls Luke into her office, where she reveals Jacob's true identity as a prominent defense attorney known for his work against police misconduct. Luke is shocked and defensive, but Bennett makes it clear that his actions will have serious repercussions. The scene ends with Luke leaving Bennett's office, his confidence shaken, as he begins to realize the gravity of his mistake. Cause and effect. The revelation of Jacob's identity not only shakes Luke, but also sets the stage for the deeper conflict that will unfold in the following chapters. The first chapter sets up the central conflict: Luke's wrongful arrest of Jacob and the immediate consequences that follow. Each scene builds on the tension from the previous one, culminating in the revelation that Jacob is not just an innocent man, but someone with significant power to challenge the system. This sets up the narrative drive for Chapter 2, where the repercussions of Luke's actions will begin to unfold both professionally and personally. Setting: Eastwood Police Precinct, early afternoon. Summary. Officer Luke Rollins starts his day with a routine patrol. He receives a briefing about a suspect wanted for recent burglaries, a tall black male, early 40s. Luke takes note of the description as he heads out on patrol. Cause and effect. The briefing sets Luke on high alert, leading him to be more suspicious as he begins his patrol. Setting, Riverside Park, late afternoon. Summary. Luke notices Jacob Foster, who matches the suspect's description, sitting on a bench. Suspicious, Luke approaches Jacob, and the interaction quickly becomes tense as Luke's questioning becomes more accusatory. Cause and effect. Luke's suspicion leads him to approach Jacob, which escalates the situation. Setting, Riverside Park, minutes later. Summary. Luke, convinced that Jacob is hiding something, arrests him despite Jacob's calm attempts to explain. The arrest takes place in front of park-goers, causing a small crowd to gather. Cause and effect. The arrest escalates the situation further, setting off a chain of events with significant repercussions. Setting, Eastwood Police Precinct, early evening. Summary. Luke processes Jacob at the precinct, while Captain Laura Bennett notices the arrest and becomes suspicious. She begins asking questions, sensing something is off. Cause and effect. Captain Bennett's suspicion initiates a deeper investigation, setting up future conflicts. Setting, Captain Bennett's office, late evening. Summary. Captain Bennett reveals Jacob's true identity as a prominent defense attorney. Luke is shocked and defensive, realizing the gravity of his mistake. Cause and effect. The revelation shakes Luke, setting the stage for the conflict in Chapter 2. Setting, Luke's home, night. Summary. Luke returns home, grappling with the consequences of his actions. His son, Ethan, notices his distress, but Luke brushes him off, hiding the severity of the situation. Cause and effect. Luke's emotional turmoil creates distance between him and Ethan, foreshadowing. Setting, Eastwood Police Precinct, next morning. Summary. Captain Bennett informs Luke that an internal investigation has been launched. Luke's colleagues begin to treat him differently, and rumors start to spread. Cause and effect. The internal investigation increases the pressure on Luke, isolating him from his peers. Setting, Jacob Foster's office, midday. Summary. Jacob reflects on the arrest and its implications. He discusses the incident with his legal team, preparing to take action against the department. His determination to seek justice grows stronger. Cause and effect. Jacob's resolve to fight back intensifies the conflict, setting the stage for a legal battle. Setting, Eastwood Police Precinct, afternoon. Summary. Ethan overhears a conversation about the incident involving his father and starts to piece together what happened. He confronts Luke, who reluctantly admits the truth. Cause and effect. Ethan's discovery creates tension between father and son, adding emotional weight to the story. Setting, Captain Bennett's office, late afternoon. Summary. Jacob's legal team sends a formal notice to the precinct, announcing their intention to sue for wrongful arrest and racial profiling. Captain Bennett warns Luke of the severity of the situation. Cause and effect. The legal threat escalates the stakes, pushing Luke further into a corner. Setting, Eastwood Police Precinct, early morning. Summary. Luke faces an internal affairs inquiry. The questioning is intense, and Luke struggles to justify his actions. He begins to realize how deep his biases may run. Cause and effect. The inquiry forces Luke to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, deepening his internal conflict. Setting, Jacob Foster's office, midday. Summary. Jacob strategizes with his legal team and decides to go public with the case. He contacts a local journalist to share his story, aiming to put pressure on the department. Cause and effect. Jacob's decision to go public puts additional pressure on the police department and heightens the stakes. Setting, Eastwood Police Precinct, afternoon. Summary. The media gets wind of the story, and reporters swarm the precinct. Luke becomes the face of the controversy, his every move scrutinized by the public. Cause and effect. The media attention amplifies the situation, making it impossible for Luke to escape the consequences of his actions. Setting: Luke's home, evening. Summary: Ethan struggles with the fallout from his father's actions, feeling torn between loyalty to his family and his sense of justice. He begins to question his own role as a police officer. Cause and effect. Ethan's inner conflict adds emotional depth to the story and foreshadows his future decisions. Setting: Captain Bennett's office, night. Summary: Captain Bennett contemplates her role in the investigation. She is torn between protecting her department and ensuring justice is served. She decides to dig deeper into the precinct's practices. Cause and effect. Captain Bennett's decision to investigate further sets the stage for uncovering deeper corruption within the department. Setting: Eastwood Police Precinct, early morning. Summary: Luke finds himself increasingly isolated at work. His colleagues distance themselves, and he feels the weight of his decisions more heavily. He begins to doubt his place in the force. Cause and effect. Luke's isolation pushes him toward a breaking point, setting up a critical decision he must make later. Setting: Jacob's home, midday. Summary: Jacob receives a tip from a whistleblower within the department, revealing evidence of widespread corruption. This new information ties into his own investigation, making his case against Luke part of a larger battle. Cause and effect. The revelation adds complexity to Jacob's mission and increases the stakes, intertwining his personal quest with a larger cause. Setting: Eastwood Police Precinct, afternoon. Summary: Ethan is approached by Captain Bennett, who subtly hints at the corruption within the department. Ethan is faced with a choice: remain loyal to his father and the force, or join the fight against the corruption. Cause and effect. Ethan's decision will have significant repercussions, influencing both his relationship with his father and the overall outcome of the story. Setting: Luke's home, evening. Summary: Luke, overwhelmed by guilt and the pressure from all sides, has a heated argument with Ethan, who accuses him of being part of the problem. The confrontation forces Luke to see the impact of his actions on his family. Cause and effect. The argument propels Luke to reconsider his stance, pushing him toward a critical decision about his future. Setting: Captain Bennett's office, night. Summary: Captain Bennett gives Luke an ultimatum: cooperate with the investigation into the department's corruption or face the consequences alone. Luke is left with a difficult choice. Cause and effect. The ultimatum forces Luke into a corner, setting up a pivotal decision that will shape the climax of the story. Setting: Luke's home, early morning. Summary: Luke makes the difficult decision to cooperate with Captain Bennett. He confides in Ethan, and they begin to mend their strained relationship. Together, they decide to take action against the corruption within the department. Cause and effect. Luke's decision to cooperate shifts the narrative, aligning him with Jacob and Captain Bennett in the fight against corruption. Setting: Captain Bennett's office, midday. Summary: Luke, Ethan, and Captain Bennett meet with Jacob to devise a plan to expose the corruption. They realize the risks involved, but are determined to see it through. Cause and effect. The formation of an alliance strengthens the protagonist's resolve, setting the stage for the final confrontation. Setting: Eastwood Police Precinct, afternoon. Summary: the team begins to gather evidence and set a trap for the corrupt officers. Tensions run high as they prepare for the operation, knowing it could all go wrong. Cause and effect. The setup heightens the suspense, leading directly into the climactic confrontation. Setting: an abandoned warehouse, night. Summary: the sting operation is in motion. Luke and Ethan play their roles, while Jacob and Captain Bennett monitor from a distance. The corrupt officers arrive, unaware of the trap, and incriminate themselves in front of hidden cameras. Cause and effect. The successful sting operation exposes the corruption, but not without complications, setting up the final resolution. Luke Rollins leaned back in his creaky desk chair, scanning the precinct's bustling operations room. The noise of ringing phones and clicking keyboards filled the air, but Luke tuned it out as he sipped his morning coffee. The bitter taste was a small comfort, grounding him as he prepared for another day on the beat. "Morning, Luke," called Officer Daniels, a younger cop with a cheerful demeanor, as he passed by Luke's desk. "Morning," Luke replied, his voice gruff, but not unfriendly. He watched Daniels disappear into the crowd, then turned his attention to the precinct's briefing room. Captain Laura Bennett, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stood at the front of the room as the officers filed in. She waited until the last one took their seat before beginning. "We got a few things to cover today," Bennett began, her tone brisk. "First, there's been a string of burglaries in the Riverside and Southwood areas. We've got a vague description of the suspect. Tall black male, early 40s, seen around some of the city's parks. Keep your eyes open for anyone matching that description." Luke nodded along with the others, but inwardly, he dismissed the information as just another day's work. He'd been a cop long enough to know that vague descriptions like this one often led to nothing. Still, he made a mental note. It was his job to stay alert, after all. The briefing continued with updates on other cases, but Luke's mind was already shifting to his usual patrol route. By the time Captain Bennett dismissed the group, Luke was on his feet, ready to get out into the city. As he left the precinct, Luke's thoughts drifted to his son, Ethan, who had just started his career as a cop. Luke was proud of him, but he couldn't help worrying. The job had changed since he'd started, and not always for the better. He shook off the thought as he stepped into his patrol car, the familiar routine of driving through Eastwood bringing him back to the present. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as Luke slowly cruised along the tree-lined streets. The park was a green oasis amidst the urban sprawl, a place where families gathered and children played. But Luke wasn't here for the scenery. He was scanning for anything out of the ordinary. As he rounded a bend, he noticed a man sitting alone on a bench near the riverbank. The man was tall, with dark skin and a neatly trimmed beard, his posture relaxed as he read from a book. He was dressed casually but neatly, his presence striking in its calmness. Luke slowed the car, his eyes narrowing as he observed the man. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The man fit the description from the briefing that morning, tall, black, early 40s. Luke's instincts, honed by years of patrolling these streets, told him to investigate. He parked the car and stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt as he approached. The man looked up from his book as Luke neared, his expression polite but guarded. "Afternoon," Luke said, his voice steady as he stopped a few feet from the bench. "Afternoon," the man replied, his tone measured. He closed the book, keeping a finger between the pages as if to mark his place. Luke glanced at the book, then back at the man. "What brings you out here today?" The man's brow furrowed slightly, as if the question puzzled him. "Just enjoying the park. It's a nice day." Luke nodded, but his eyes continued to assess the man. "You from around here?" The man's lips curled into a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The noncommittal answer raised Luke's hackles. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more authoritative. "Mind if I see some ID?" The man's smile faded, and for a moment, the air between them grew tense. "Am I under arrest?" the man asked, his tone calm but firm. Luke bristled at the question. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who seemed so sure of themselves. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Luke shot back, his hand inching toward his holster. The man remained still, his eyes locked on Luke's. After a long moment, he reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out his wallet, handing over his ID. Luke took it, his eyes flicking to the name, Jacob Foster. It didn't mean anything to him, but the suspicion gnawing at him didn't dissipate. "Stand up," Luke ordered, stepping back to give Jacob room. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he complied, rising from the bench with deliberate slowness. He kept his hands visible, his gaze steady as Luke pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The moment the cold metal clicked around Jacob's wrists, Luke felt a pang of unease, but he ignored it. He had a job to do, and this man was a potential suspect. That was all that mattered. Luke led Jacob to the patrol car, his grip firm on Jacob's arm. The park, once peaceful, now felt charged with tension. Luke was aware of the eyes of the park-goers on them, some watching with open curiosity, others with silent judgment. As they reached the car, Jacob spoke for the first time since being cuffed. "You're making a mistake, officer." Luke didn't respond. He opened the back door and guided Jacob inside, the unease he'd felt earlier now growing stronger. He closed the door, taking a moment to collect himself before getting into the driver's seat. The drive back to the precinct was tense and silent. Luke's thoughts churned, but he forced himself to focus on the road. He had arrested plenty of people in his time. Why did this feel different? As they pulled up to the precinct, Luke noticed Captain Bennett standing near the entrance, her sharp eyes narrowing as she saw him escort Jacob out of the car. Her presence only heightened the unease gnawing at him, but he pushed it aside as he led Jacob inside. The buzz of activity in the precinct seemed louder than usual as Luke guided Jacob toward the processing desk. He could feel Captain Bennett's gaze on him, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. He hated being scrutinized, especially when he wasn't entirely sure of himself. "Caught this guy in Riverside," Luke said to Officer Jenkins, the young cop behind the desk, as he handed over Jacob's ID. Jenkins took the ID and glanced at it, his eyes flicking up to Jacob's face before returning to the computer in front of him. "What's the charge?" Jenkins asked, his tone neutral. "Suspicion of involvement in those burglaries we've been tracking," Luke replied, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Jenkins nodded but didn't look convinced. As he typed in Jacob's information, Captain Bennett approached, her expression unreadable. "Officer Rollins," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of authority that made Luke's stomach tighten. "A word in my office, please." Luke hesitated, glancing at Jenkins, who was still processing Jacob, before nodding. "Yes, Captain." He followed Bennett through the precinct, the familiar hallways feeling suddenly foreign. The noise of the precinct faded as they entered her office, and she closed the door behind them. "Have a seat," she said, motioning to the chair opposite her desk. Luke sat down, feeling like a schoolboy called into the principal's office. Bennett sat as well, folding her hands on the desk as she regarded him with those sharp green eyes. "Tell me about the man you just brought in," she said, her voice even. Luke cleared his throat. "Found him sitting alone in Riverside Park. He matched the description from the briefing this morning, tall, black, early 40s. When I questioned him, he was evasive, didn't want to show ID at first. Figured it was worth bringing him in for questioning." Bennett didn't respond immediately. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Luke's face. "You know who Jacob Foster is?" The name sent a jolt through Luke. He looked at her, confusion and apprehension battling for dominance in his mind. "No, should I?" "Jacob Foster is one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in the state," Bennett said, her tone flat. "He's known for his work against police misconduct, and he's got connections in high places." Luke felt his heart drop. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The implications of what Bennett was saying were hitting him like a freight train. "You arrested an innocent man, Luke," Bennett continued, her voice softening slightly. "And not just any man. This could blow up into something much bigger." Luke finally found his voice, though it was weak. I didn't know." He was acting suspicious, and suspicious how? Bennett pressed, her gaze hardening again. Because he didn't want to show his ID right away? Because he was a black man sitting alone in a park? The truth in her words stung. Luke had prided himself on being a fair cop, but now he was seeing the situation through Bennett's eyes, and it wasn't a pretty picture. "What do we do now?" Luke asked, his voice. Luke Rollins sat on the edge of his bed, his head buried in his hands. The day's events played over and over in his mind like a broken record. He had made a terrible mistake, one that could cost him everything he had worked for. The familiar hum of the house was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. His wife, Karen, was still out at a community event, and the house felt emptier than usual. A soft knock on the bedroom door startled him. He looked up to see his son, Ethan, standing in the doorway, concern etched on his young face. "Dad, are you okay?" Ethan asked, stepping into the room. Luke forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Ethan. Just a rough day at work." Ethan didn't look convinced. "Mom's still out, and I noticed you didn't eat dinner. Do you want me to make you something?" Luke shook his head, the thought of food turning his stomach. "No, thanks. I'm just not hungry." Ethan hesitated, then sat down on the bed next to his father. You know, if something's bothering you, you can talk to me. I might not have all the answers, but I'm here to listen. Luke sighed, appreciating his son's concern, but unwilling to burden him with the details of the day. It's just work, Ethan. You'll understand when you've been on the force as long as I have. Some days are harder than others. Ethan nodded slowly, sensing there was more to it, but knowing better than to push. All right, Dad, but if you need anything, I'm here. Luke placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it gently. Thanks, son. I appreciate it. As Ethan left the room, Luke felt a pang of guilt. He had always been the strong one, the dependable one, but now he was the one falling apart. And he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep this from his family. The next morning, Luke walked into the precinct with a heaviness in his chest. The usual buzz of activity seemed muted, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Luke noticed the sideways glances from his colleagues, the whispers that stopped as soon as he entered the room. "Morning, Rollins," Officer Daniels greeted him, but his tone lacked the usual warmth. Luke forced a nod, feeling the weight of the scrutiny. He made his way to his desk, trying to focus on the paperwork that had piled up overnight. But before he could get settled, Captain Bennett appeared at his side. "Luke, I need to see you in my office," she said, her voice as unreadable as her expression. Luke's heart sank as he followed her through the precinct. When they entered her office, Bennett closed the door and motioned for him to sit. "I wanted to let you know that an internal investigation has been launched into yesterday's arrest," Bennett said, her tone professional, but with a hint of concern. "It's standard procedure, given the circumstances, but I need you to be prepared for what's coming." Luke nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought. "I understand, Captain." Bennett studied him for a moment before continuing. "Luke, you've been a solid officer for years, but this incident has raised some serious concerns. I need you to be honest with me. What were you thinking when you made that arrest?" Luke hesitated, the events of the previous day flashing through his mind. I thought I was doing the right thing." The description matched, and he was acting suspiciously. "Suspiciously how?" Bennett pressed. Luke faltered. "He didn't want to show me his ID at first. I thought he might be hiding something." Bennett leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving his. "Luke, I need you to take a hard look at what happened. We can't afford to have our officers making decisions based on assumptions, especially ones that could lead to racial profiling." The word stung, but Luke knew she was right. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. "What happens now?" Bennett sighed. "The investigation will run its course, and until then, you'll remain on active duty, but I want you to be cautious. This isn't just about you, Luke. It's about the integrity of the entire department." Luke nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, but now he wasn't so sure. Across town, Jacob Foster sat in his sleek office, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of the city below was one he usually found calming, but today it only served as a reminder of the battle ahead. He had spent the previous night going over the details of his wrongful arrest, the injustice of it burning in his chest. Now, as he sat with his legal team, he was more determined than ever to take action. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "This is about the system that allows it to happen. We need to make sure this case shines a light on the broader issues at play." One of his attorneys, Sarah, nodded in agreement. "We can file a lawsuit for wrongful arrest and racial profiling, but we'll need to gather as much evidence as possible. Witness statements, body cam footage, anything that can support our case." Jacob leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I also want to go public with this. The people need to know what's happening in their police department. We can't let this be swept under the rug." Sarah hesitated. "Going public will bring a lot of attention, and not all of it will be positive. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice. If I don't stand up now, what was it all for? We need to do this, Sarah, and we need to do it right." The room fell silent as the gravity of Jacob's words sank in. They all knew the risks involved, but they also knew the importance of the fight ahead. This wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about changing a system that had been broken for far too long. Later that afternoon, Ethan Rollins was finishing up some paperwork in the precinct when he overheard a conversation between two officers. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the mention of his father's name caught his attention. "Did you hear about Rollins?" one of the officers whispered. "Word is he's in hot water over that arrest yesterday." "Yeah, I heard. Some big-time lawyer, too. This could get ugly." Ethan's heart pounded as he processed their words. He had known something was wrong with his father last night, but Luke had brushed it off as just another bad day. Now, it seemed there was more to the story. Without thinking, Ethan gathered his things and headed toward his father's desk. He found Luke sitting there, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at a stack of papers. "Dad, we need to talk," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. Luke looked up, surprised to see his son standing there. "What's going on, Ethan?" Ethan glanced around, making sure no one was listening, before lowering his voice. "I heard some of the guys talking. They said you're in trouble because of an arrest yesterday. Is it true?" Luke's face tightened, and he let out a long sigh. "It's complicated, Ethan. I made a mistake, one that could cost me my career." Ethan's heart sank. "What happened?" Luke hesitated, but he knew he couldn't keep this from his son any longer. "I arrested a man yesterday, Jacob Foster. He fit the description of a suspect we were looking for, but I was wrong. He's a defense attorney, and now he's taking legal action against me and the department." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process the information. "So, what happens now?" "There's an internal investigation," Luke said, his voice heavy with regret. "And if this goes to court?" "I don't know, Ethan. I just don't know." Ethan felt a wave of anger and frustration. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Luke shook his head, the guilt weighing on him like a lead blanket. "I didn't want to worry you. You've got enough on your plate, starting out on the force." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I'm your son, Dad. I should be able to help you with this." Luke reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I know, son, and I'm sorry. But right now, I need to figure out how to fix this mess." Ethan nodded, though the tension between them lingered. He wanted to help his father, but he wasn't sure how. All he knew was that the situation was spiraling out of control, and it felt like they were powerless to stop it. As the day drew to a close, Luke found himself back in Captain Bennett's office, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. Bennett was seated behind her desk, her expression as unreadable as ever. "We just received a formal notice from Jacob Foster's legal team." Luke Rollins sat in a cold, sterile room within the Eastwood Police Precinct. The walls, painted a dull gray, seemed to close in on him as he faced the two internal affairs officers sitting across the table. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. "Officer Rollins, let's go over the events leading up to the arrest," said Officer Matthews, a stern-looking man in his 50s with a sharp gaze that made Luke feel like he was under a microscope. Luke took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "I was patrolling Riverside Park when I noticed a man who matched the description of a suspect we'd been briefed on earlier that day. I approached him, and he was evasive when I asked for his ID. That's when I decided to bring him in." Officer Matthews leaned forward, his expression unyielding. "Evasive how exactly?" Luke hesitated, the memory of Jacob Foster's calm demeanor flashing through his mind. He didn't immediately offer his ID, and his responses were vague. The other officer, Detective Harris, a younger man with a calculating expression, chimed in. "And you felt that was enough to justify an arrest? Did you consider that he might have been a law-abiding citizen, simply enjoying his day?" Luke swallowed hard, the weight of their scrutiny bearing down on him. "At the time, I believed I was following protocol. I thought I was making the right call." Matthews exchanged a glance with Harris before turning back to Luke. "Officer Rollins, we've reviewed the body cam footage, and it doesn't support the level of suspicion you're describing. You need to be honest with yourself. Was there something else influencing your decision?" Luke's heart raced. He knew what they were getting at, but admitting to his biases was something he wasn't ready to confront. I just did what I thought was right." The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Matthew spoke again, his voice lower, but no less intense. Officer Rollins, this inquiry isn't just about this one incident. It's about ensuring that our officers uphold the standards of justice and fairness we're sworn to protect. We'll be in touch." With that, the officer stood, signaling the end of the questioning. Luke left the room, feeling more uncertain than ever about his place in the force. Meanwhile, across town, Jacob Foster sat in his sleek, modern office, surrounded by his legal team. The sun poured through the large windows, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Despite the serene setting, the atmosphere was charged with tension. "We need to make sure this doesn't get buried," Jacob said, his voice firm. "The department needs to be held accountable, and the public has a right to know what's going on." Sarah, one of his top attorneys, nodded in agreement. "We've already gathered enough evidence to file a lawsuit, but if we go public with this, it will put even more pressure on the department. The media will eat this up, especially with your reputation behind it." Jacob leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "We need to be strategic. If we go public, it has to be at the right time and with the right message. This isn't just about me. It's about systemic issues that go far beyond one wrongful arrest." Another attorney, Marcus, added, "We should reach out to a journalist who's known for covering these types of cases. Someone who can tell the story with the gravity it deserves." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "I know just a person. I'll make the call." As the meeting continued, the team worked through the details of their strategy, each decision carefully weighed. Jacob knew this was about more than just his own experience. It was about setting a precedent, about using his platform to shine a light on the injustices that too often went unchecked. By the afternoon, the precinct was buzzing with a different kind of energy. Reporters had started gathering outside the building, their cameras and microphones ready to capture the latest development in what had quickly become a high-profile case. Inside, Luke felt the weight of their presence. As he walked through the precinct, he noticed the uneasy glances from his colleagues. The whispers had grown louder, and it was clear that he had become the center of a controversy that was only growing larger. Captain Bennett approached him, her expression serious. "Luke, I need you to stay focused. The media is here, and they're not going to leave until they get something. We need to manage this carefully." Luke nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. "What should I do?" "For now, keep your head down and do your job. Let the department handle the media." "But Luke," she paused, her gaze softening slightly, "you need to be prepared. This isn't going to blow over easily." Luke swallowed, nodding again. "I understand, Captain." As Bennett walked away, Luke caught sight of the reporters through the window. The realization hit him hard. There was no escaping this. His every move was now under a microscope, and the public was watching. Later that evening, back at the Rollins family home, the tension that had been building all day finally boiled over. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. Across from him, Luke could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice tinged with frustration. "This whole thing is getting out of control. I heard some of the guys talking at the precinct today. They're saying you might lose your job." Luke sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know, Ethan, and I wish I could tell you that everything's going to be fine, but the truth is I don't know what's going to happen." Ethan's jaw clenched, the tension evident in his posture. "How did it come to this? You've always been so careful, so by the book. What made you think that guy was a criminal?" Luke met his son's eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I made a mistake, Ethan. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and now I'm paying the price." Ethan shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "I joined the force because I wanted to do the right thing, to make a difference. But now I'm not so sure I even know what that means anymore." Luke reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's arm. "Ethan, you're a good cop, better than I ever was. And I know this is hard, but don't lose sight of why you started. This job, it's about more than just the badge. It's about justice, about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Ethan looked down, his expression conflicted. "But what if the system we're part of isn't just? What if we're part of the problem?" Luke's heart ached at his son's words, knowing the truth in them. "Then it's up to us to make it better. We can't ignore the problems, But we also can't give up. We have to fight for what's right, even if it means facing the consequences. Ethan nodded slowly, though the doubt in his eyes remained. As he stood to leave the table, Luke felt the sting of their strained relationship. He had always been Ethan's hero, but now he wasn't sure how to repair the damage he had done. Late that night, Captain Laura Bennett sat alone in her office, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. The day had been exhausting, and the weight of the decisions she faced pressed heavily on her shoulders. She stared at the stack of reports on her desk, each one a piece of the puzzle she was trying to put together. The deeper she dug into the department's practices, the more she realized how deep the problems ran. This wasn't just about Luke Rollins. This was about a culture that had allowed biases and misconduct to fester for far too long. Bennett knew she had to make a choice. She could protect the department, keep the investigation quiet, and hope the media storm blew over. Or she could dig deeper, expose the rot at the core, and risk tearing the department apart from the inside. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to clear her mind. The voices of the officers under her command echoed in her thoughts, their trust and loyalty weighing heavily on her conscience. But then she thought of Jacob Foster, of the people who had been wronged by the very system she had sworn to uphold. She couldn't ignore the truth, no matter how painful it was. With a deep breath, Bennett made her decision. She would dig deeper, no matter the cost. The department needed to change, and she would be the one to lead that charge, even if it meant risking her career. As she reached for the phone to make the first of many difficult calls, Bennett felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The fight ahead would be hard, but she knew it was the right thing to do. The truth had to come out, and justice had to be served, no matter the cost. Luke Rollins walked into the Eastwood Police Precinct the next morning, the weight of the previous days hanging heavily on his shoulders. The usual hustle and bustle of the precinct felt distant, as if he were moving through a fog. Colleagues who had once greeted him with friendly nods and smiles now averted their eyes, their conversations dying down as he passed. He made his way to his desk, the silence around him deafening. As he sat down, he noticed a few of his fellow officers glancing his way, their expressions a mix of pity and suspicion. It was clear that the news of the investigation and the media attention had spread, and Luke was now a pariah in his own workplace. The once familiar precinct now felt like enemy territory. Luke's fingers hovered over his keyboard, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel the judgment from his colleagues, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. How could someone with his experience make such a grave mistake? The isolation gnawed at him. Luke had always been a part of the team, respected for his years of service. But now, he was an outsider, someone to be watched, not trusted. The weight of it all was pushing him toward a breaking point, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold on. Meanwhile, across town, Jacob Foster sat in his study at home, sifting through a pile of documents spread across his desk. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, but Jacob's focus was entirely on the task at hand. A knock on the door drew his attention. "Come in," he called, not looking up. Sarah, his lead attorney, entered the room, a folder in her hand. "We've just received some new information," she said, placing the folder on his desk. A whistleblower from within the department reached out. "They provided us with evidence of widespread corruption, bribes, falsified reports, you name it." Jacob's eyes widened as he opened the folder, scanning the contents. "This is huge," he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "This could be the key to everything." Sarah nodded. "It ties into your case against Luke Rollins. It's not just about his wrongful arrest. It's part of something much bigger." Jacob leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The revelation added a new layer to his mission. What had started as a personal quest for justice was now a battle against the systemic corruption that had infiltrated the Eastwood Police Department. The stakes were higher than ever, and Jacob knew he had to tread carefully. "This changes everything," he said, his voice resolute. "We need to be strategic about how we use this information. If we expose this corruption, we could bring down the entire department." Sarah agreed, her expression serious. "We'll need to work closely with our sources to ensure their safety, but this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." As they continued to discuss their next steps, Jacob felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight ahead would be difficult, but the truth had to come out. The corruption within the department was deeper than he had initially thought, and now he was more determined than ever to see justice served. Back at the precinct, Ethan Rollins was struggling with his own inner turmoil. He had just finished a shift and was heading out when Captain Bennett approached him. "Ethan, do you have a minute?" she asked, her tone more gentle than usual. Ethan nodded, following her into a quiet corner of the precinct. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ethan braced himself for whatever was coming. "I know this has been a difficult time for you," Bennett began, her gaze steady. "Your father's situation has put you in a tough spot, and I want you to know that I understand the pressure you're under." Ethan remained silent, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I've been looking into some things within the department," Bennett continued, choosing her words carefully. "There's more going on here than just your father's arrest of Jacob Foster. There's corruption, deep, systemic corruption, and I believe your father has unknowingly been a part of it." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from Bennett made it all the more real. "Ethan, you have a choice to make," Bennett said, her voice soft but firm. "You can continue to stand by your father, or you can help me expose what's really going on in this department. I won't lie to you. This won't be easy, and it will put you in a difficult position. But the truth needs to come out." Ethan's mind raced as he considered her words. He had always looked up to his father, but the recent events had shaken his faith in everything he believed in. He wanted to do the right thing, but what was the right thing in this situation? "I need to think about it," Ethan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett nodded, understanding the weight of the decision he faced. "Take your time, Ethan. But remember, sometimes doing the right thing means standing up, even when it's hard." Ethan left the precinct that day feeling more conflicted than ever. The choice before him was clear, but the consequences were terrifying. He knew that whatever decision he made, there would be no going back. That evening, Luke returned home, the exhaustion of the day weighing heavily on him. He barely noticed the warm glow of the living room lights as he walked through the door, his mind still lost in the chaos of the precinct. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, his expression tense. "Dad, we need to talk." Luke paused, his heart sinking. He could see the strain in his son's face, the same struggle he had been feeling himself. "What is it, Ethan?" Ethan looked down at his hands, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Captain Bennett approached me today. She told me about the corruption in the department and that you might be involved." Luke's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about? I'm not corrupt. I've spent my entire career trying to do the right thing." "I know, Dad," Ethan said, his voice wavering. "But what if you were used? What if you were part of something bigger and didn't even know it?" Luke's anger flared, driven by fear and frustration. "I'm not a puppet, Ethan. I've always made my own decisions. If there's corruption in the department, I'm not part of it. But what if you were, without realizing it?" Ethan pressed, his voice growing more desperate. "What if your arrest of Jacob Foster was part of a plan to cover something up?" Luke felt the ground shift beneath him. The idea that he could have been manipulated, that he could have unknowingly contributed to something so vile, was almost too much to bear. He sank into a chair, the anger draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion. "I don't know, Ethan," he finally said, his voice hollow. "I don't know what's real anymore." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, seeing his father so broken. "Dad, we need to figure this out together. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to lose myself." Luke looked at his son, seeing the pain and confusion mirrored in his own heart. "You're right," he said softly. "We need to figure this out, no matter what it takes." Later that night, Luke sat in Captain Bennett's office, the weight of the day pressing down on him like never before. Bennett's expression was serious, her eyes filled with concern as she looked at him across the desk. "Luke, I've been digging into the corruption within the department, and I'm afraid it's worse than we thought," she said, her voice grave. "There's a group of officers who have been involved in everything from taking bribes to covering up crimes. And the more I uncover, the more I realize that your arrest of Jacob Foster might have been part of their plan." Luke's heart sank. "You're saying I was used?" I'm saying there's a possibility, Bennett replied, her tone gentle but firm. And that's why I'm giving you an ultimatum. You can either cooperate with the investigation, help us take down the corrupt officers, or you can choose to protect yourself and risk going down with them. Luke's mind raced. The thought of betraying his fellow officers, of turning against the department he had served for so long, was terrifying. But the thought of being part of something so wrong, even unknowingly, was even worse. What happens if I cooperate? He asked, his voice trembling. Bennett leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. If you cooperate, you'll be helping to expose the truth and clean up this department. It won't be easy, and it might cost you your career, but you'll be doing the right thing. Luke closed his eyes, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He knew what he had to do, but the fear of the unknown was overwhelming. I need some time to think, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett nodded, understanding the gravity of the choice he faced. Take the time you need, Luke. But remember, the truth always comes out, one way or another. Early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of the Rollins family home as Luke sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The weight of the previous night's conversation with Captain Bennett pressed down on him, his mind racing with the implications of the choice he had to make. He heard the soft creak of the floorboards as Ethan entered the room, his face drawn and tense. Without a word, Ethan sat down across from his father, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with concern, "we can't keep going like this. You need to make a decision." "We both do." Luke nodded slowly, the lines on his face deepening with the burden of what he was about to say. "I know, son. I've been thinking about it all night. Captain Bennett gave me an ultimatum, and I've realized that if we want to do the right thing, we have to face this head-on." Ethan's eyes softened with a mix of relief and apprehension. "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means I'm going to cooperate with Bennett," Luke replied, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're going to take down the corruption in this department, no matter what it costs." Ethan felt a surge of emotions, pride in his father's decision, but also fear for what lay ahead. "I'm with you, Dad. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Luke reached across the table, placing a hand on Ethan's. "Thank you, son. I'm sorry for everything, for dragging you into this. But together, we can make a difference." The two men shared a moment of solidarity, the bond between them stronger than ever despite the challenges they faced. They both knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to stand together and fight for what was right. By midday, Luke and Ethan arrived at Captain Bennett's office, the tension in the air palpable as they prepared for the meeting. Inside, Bennett was waiting, along with Jacob Foster, who had been working tirelessly to expose the corruption within the department. "Thank you both for coming," Bennett began, her tone serious. "We don't have much time, so let's get straight to it. We've gathered enough evidence to set a trap for the corrupt officers, but we need your help to pull it off." Jacob nodded in agreement. "This operation needs to be flawless. If we make one wrong move, they'll either walk free or retaliate. We can't afford any mistakes." Luke exchanged a glance with Ethan before addressing the group. "We're in. Whatever it takes to bring these guys down, we're ready." Bennett spread a series of documents and photos across the table, outlining the plan. "We've identified the key players involved in the corruption ring. The plan is to lure them into a sting operation, where they'll incriminate themselves on camera. Luke, you and Ethan will play crucial roles in setting up the meeting." Luke leaned forward, studying the details of the plan. "And what about backup? We can't risk them getting away." "Don't worry. We'll have a team on standby, ready to move in as soon as we have what we need," Bennett assured them. "But we have to be careful. These officers are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to protect themselves if they feel cornered." Ethan felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. "What's our cover story? How do we get them to trust us enough to show up?" Jacob answered, his voice calm but determined. "We'll make them think it's a routine meeting to discuss their business. They've been operating under the assumption that they're untouchable, so we'll use that arrogance against them." As they continued to finalize the details, The gravity of the situation settled over the room. Each of them knew the risks involved, but they also knew that this was their best chance to bring down the corruption that had tainted their department for far too long. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the Eastwood Police Precinct as the team prepared for the sting operation. The tension among them was almost tangible, a mix of anticipation and dread as they finalized the last-minute details. Luke and Ethan suited up, their faces set with determination. They knew the roles they had to play, and the stakes were too high for any mistakes. Luke adjusted his uniform, the weight of the badge on his chest feeling heavier than usual. This wasn't just about doing his job. It was about reclaiming the integrity of the force he had dedicated his life to. "Are you ready?" Luke asked, turning to his son. Ethan nodded, though the anxiety in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm ready, Dad. Let's do this." They exited the precinct and headed to the location where the operation would take place, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a location often used by the corrupt officers for their illicit deals, making it the perfect place to spring the trap. As they drove in silence, Luke couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He had been in plenty of high-stakes situations before, but this was different. This time, the enemy wasn't some faceless criminal. It was people he had once trusted, officers who had worn the same uniform as him. Arriving at the warehouse, they met with Captain Bennett and Jacob, who were already in position. Hidden cameras had been placed around the meeting area, and the backup team was stationed just out of sight, ready to move in at a moment's notice. "We're all set," Bennett confirmed, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Now, we just need to wait for them to arrive." The waiting was the hardest part. Time seemed to stretch as they stood there, each of them lost in their own thoughts, knowing that everything they had worked for hinged on the success of this operation. Night had fallen by the time the corrupt officers arrived at the warehouse. Luke and Ethan watched from their concealed position as the officers, three men with hardened faces and a dangerous air about them, stepped out of their vehicles. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as he and Ethan moved into position, ready to play their parts. They approached the officers with a casual confidence, masking the tension that simmered beneath the surface. "Evening, gentlemen," Luke greeted them, his voice steady. "Ready to talk business?" One of the officers, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, nodded, eyeing Luke and Ethan with suspicion. "What's this about, Rollins? You've never been involved in this side of things before." Luke forced a grin, trying to appear nonchalant. "Things change. I've seen the benefits of being on the right side of the action, and I figured it's time I get my cut." The officer with the scar studied Luke for a moment longer before nodding. "Fair enough. Let's get this done." They moved inside the warehouse, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Luke and Ethan led the officers to the designated meeting area, where the hidden cameras were already recording every word, every movement. As the conversation unfolded, the corrupt officers began to incriminate themselves, discussing past deals, payoffs, and even the cover-ups they had orchestrated within the department. Luke felt a surge of relief as he realized the plan was working. They were finally going to bring these men to justice. But just as the sting seemed to be reaching its climax, something went wrong. One of the officers, sensing something was off, suddenly pulled out a gun, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Luke and Ethan. "You set us up," he snarled, his finger hovering over the trigger. Luke's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing for a way to defuse the situation. "You're making a mistake," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's just talk this out." But the officer wasn't listening. Panic flashed in his eyes as he realized the walls were closing in. "You think you can take us down? You're dead wrong." Before anyone could react, the officer fired a shot. The sound echoed through the warehouse, a deafening crack that shattered the tension and sent everyone into motion. In that split second, the backup team stormed in, their weapons drawn, shouting commands as they moved to subdue the corrupt officers. Luke and Ethan dove for cover, adrenaline surging through their veins as the situation spiraled out of control. When the dust finally settled, the corrupt officers were in custody, handcuffed and escorted out of the warehouse by the backup team. The sting had been successful, but the close call had left everyone shaken. Luke and Ethan stood side by side, catching their breath as they surveyed the scene. The relief of having survived the operation was tempered by the knowledge of how close they had come to disaster. Captain Bennett approached them, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You two did well," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the night's events. "We got what we needed. The corruption in this department is going to be exposed, thanks to you." Luke nodded, though the adrenaline still coursing through his system made it hard to fully process her words. "We couldn't have done it without you, Captain." Bennett smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "This is just the beginning. There's going to be a lot of fallout from this, but we've taken the first step." As they left the warehouse, the reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. The corruption that had plagued their department was finally being brought to light, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Luke glanced at Ethan, who was staring into the distance, lost in thought. "Are you okay, son?" Ethan looked at his father, his expression serious but resolute. "Yeah, Dad. I think I am. We did the right thing tonight." Luke felt a swell of pride as he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We sure did. And no matter what happens next, we'll face it together." As they walked away from the warehouse, the weight of the night's events began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope. They had taken the first step toward justice, and though the battle was far from over, they were ready to see it through, together. The morning after the sting, the Eastwood Police Precinct was buzzing with an energy that Luke hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the usual chatter of routine police work. It was something deeper, more significant, a sense that the tide was finally turning. Luke walked into the precinct with Ethan by his side, their steps heavy with the weight of the previous night's events. As they passed their colleagues, some nodded in acknowledgement, while others looked away, unable to meet Luke's eyes. The successful sting operation had taken down several high-ranking officers, and the precinct was now a place of uncertainty. Captain Bennett was waiting for them in her office, her expression one of both relief and resolve. "Good morning," she greeted them, her tone serious. "We got a lot to discuss." Luke and Ethan took their seats across from her, the tension in the room palpable. "What's the situation?" Luke asked, his voice steady but edged with concern. Bennett leaned forward, clasping her hands together on the desk. "The operation was a success, but the fallout is just beginning. The officers we arrested have already started talking, and the corruption runs deeper than we anticipated. This is going to lead to a full-scale investigation, not just within our precinct, but across the entire city." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What does that mean for us?" Bennett met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. "For you, Ethan, it means you've done your duty. You're not implicated in any of this, and your actions last night showed where your loyalties truly lie. But for your father," she turned to Luke, her expression hardening, "there's still the matter of the initial arrest of Jacob Foster. The investigation will determine whether your actions were influenced by the corruption we've uncovered, or if they were simply a mistake born of poor judgment." Luke nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "I understand, Captain. I'm ready to face whatever comes." Bennett leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "I believe you are, Luke, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that this could end your career. The media is already all over this story, and they'll be looking for someone to blame." Luke swallowed hard, but his resolve remained firm. "I'll take responsibility for my actions. All I want is to see justice done." Bennett nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Then let's make sure that happens." Across town, Jacob Foster stood in his office, looking out at the city he had fought so hard to protect. The previous night's events had left him with a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The sting operation had not only exposed the corruption within the police department, but had also given him a chance to right the wrongs of his past. Sarah, his lead attorney, entered the office, a satisfied smile on her face. "The press is eating this up," she said, holding up a stack of newspapers with headlines about the sting operation. "You've done it, Jacob. You've exposed the corruption and shown the world that justice can prevail." Jacob turned to her, his expression serious. "It's not just about exposing corruption, Sarah. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. We've won this battle, but the war is far from over. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. What's next for you? Jacob sighed, his gaze drifting back to the cityscape. I'm going to keep fighting. There's still so much work to be done, and I'm not ready to stop. But first, I need to talk to Luke. There's something I need to say to him. Sarah smiled softly. You've both been through a lot. I think that conversation is long overdue. Jacob nodded, the decision already made in his mind. It's time to close this chapter and start a new one. Later that afternoon, Jacob arrived at the Eastwood Police Precinct, the tension in the air almost tangible as he walked through the front doors. The officers he passed glanced at him with a mix of respect and wariness, aware of who he was and what he had accomplished. Captain Bennett greeted him in the lobby, her expression neutral but respectful. Mr. Foster, thank you for coming. Luke is waiting for you in the conference room. Jacob nodded, following her down the hallway. As they reached the door to the conference room, Bennett paused, looking him in the eye. Whatever happens in there, know that you've made a difference. We all have. Jacob gave her a small, appreciative smile. Thank you, Captain. With that, Bennett opened the door, and Jacob stepped inside. Luke was standing at the far end of the room, looking out the window, his posture tense. When he heard Jacob enter, he turned around, his expression guarded. Jacob, Luke began, his voice rough. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after everything that's happened. Jacob walked further into the room, stopping a few feet away from Luke. I needed to see you, Luke. We've been through a lot, and there are things that need to be said. Luke nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. I'm sorry for what I did. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I made a terrible mistake. If I could take it back, I would. Jacob studied him for a moment, then nodded. I believe you, Luke. But this isn't just about one mistake. It's about the system that allowed it to happen and the work we need to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. Luke's gaze met Jacob's, a flicker of hope in his eyes. What do we do now? We move forward, Jacob replied, his tone firm. Together, we work to rebuild trust in this department, in this city, and we hold ourselves accountable every step of the way. Luke nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. I'm ready to do that, whatever it takes. Jacob extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Luke took it, shaking firmly. The gesture was more than just an agreement. It was a sign of mutual respect and a commitment to the path they would walk together. A few weeks later, the internal investigation into the Eastwood Police Department reached its conclusion. The corrupt officers who had been exposed in the sting operation were formally charged and removed from the force. The department was undergoing a major overhaul, with new leadership and reforms aimed at preventing future misconduct. As for Luke, the investigation into his arrest of Jacob Foster had also come to a close. The department's review board found that while Luke's actions had been misguided, they were not part of the larger corruption scheme. However, the board recommended disciplinary action, which included a temporary suspension and mandatory retraining on bias and de-escalation techniques. Luke accepted the verdict with humility, knowing that it was a fair and just outcome. He had made mistakes, but he was determined to learn from them and become a better officer. When the suspension was announced, Ethan stood by his father's side, his respect for Luke only deepened by the way he had faced the consequences of his actions. I'm proud of you, Dad, Ethan said as they left the precinct together. You did the right thing. Luke smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. We both did, son, and that's what matters. The Eastwood Police Precinct was a different place now. The old guard had been replaced, and a new era of accountability and transparency was beginning to take shape. The reforms that Captain Bennett and Jacob Foster had fought for were being implemented, and the department was slowly rebuilding the trust it had lost. Luke returned to duty after his suspension, a changed man. He approached his work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to uphold the principles of justice and fairness that he had once taken for granted. Jacob continued his work as a defense attorney, but with a new focus on collaboration with law enforcement to address systemic issues from within. He and Luke stayed in touch, working together on community outreach programs and initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between the police and the people they served. Ethan, too, found his place within the new precinct, using his experience to mentor younger officers and advocate for the changes that were still needed. He and Luke grew closer, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. As the months passed, the city of Eastwood began to heal. The shadows of corruption that had once loomed over the precinct were slowly being pushed back, replaced by a light of hope and renewal. And as Luke stood on the steps of the precinct one evening, looking out at the city he had served for so many years, he felt a sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still long, and there were many challenges to face, but for the first time in a long while, Luke knew they were on the right path. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had begun to bring the light back to Eastwood. The journey was far from over, but with each step they took, they were moving toward a brighter future, one where justice and integrity would prevail, no matter the cost.